The derelict had been dead long enough to grow its own weather, a thin haze of outgassed frost hanging around the hull like breath that never warmed. And Mara Teng watched her company's extraction template reach into it and kill 9 months of careful drift in 9 seconds. She did not at first understand that she was watching it die. On the rig feed, it looked like a clean grab. Mara Teng was a salvager, which meant her trade was pulling the working pieces out of dead ships and selling them to someone who could use them. What lifted it above scrap picking was what the dead ships were made of. Almost nothing that mattered in the galaxy had been built by anyone still alive to ask. Faster than light travel, the deep machinery that let 100 species cross between the stars and speak across the dark. All of it was the inheritance. Alien technology so old its makers were gone and unaccounted for, left scattered through space for whoever came after to find, run, and never quite understand. Humanity had arrived late and inherited the use of it like everyone else. You ran the gift. You did not know how it worked. A derelict like the one on her feed was a single dead inheritance hull, drifting wherever its builders had abandoned it, and its worth was not the hull. It was what the hull carried. An inheritance ship was built around its components. Discrete sealed units of inherited tech, each one seated in a socket along the frame, the way a stone sits in a setting. Pull a component out whole, and a broker paid real money for it. Crack it working it loose, and you had a bag of dead structure worth nothing. The entire craft of salvage lived in the gap between those two outcomes, and Mara had spent half her life learning to land on the right side of it by hand, which was why the thing on her feed should have bothered her more than it did. What was reaching into the derelict was not a pair of salvagers' hands. It was a template, and not the paper kind. In combine work, a template was an automated extraction routine. One fixed grabbing motion the rig performed on every socket of every site, identical every time, driven by a program rather than a judgment. The machine did not need to know what a component was. It only needed to repeat the motion. The combine called that the future of the trade, and Mara had been paid for 3 years to agree. The rig was called the ingot, which told you everything about the people who named it. It was a Verge reclamation mass extraction platform. Half a kilometer of armature and drone cradles and brute force template machinery, and Mara Teng ran the field crew that fed it. 3 years ago, she had been a reach salvage contractor herself, working sites one component at a time, undercut on every bid by exactly the kind of operation she now worked for. Verge had hired her off the line because she was good, and because she was cheap, and because she had stopped being able to afford pride. The combine paid by tonnage cleared. Mara's crew cleared more tonnage in a shift than her old independent self had cleared in a season. The rig smelled like every commercial operation she'd ever worked. Scrubbed air with a chemical sweetness under it, the smell of a place cleaned on a schedule by people who were not the people who worked it. Her old independent skiff had smelled like ozone, and her own coffee, and the particular reek of a recycler she could never quite afford to service. She missed the skiff. She did not miss being undercut on every bid until she lost it. The site was a good one. The database had flagged it amber rich, a frontier derelict, inheritance built, drifting at the ragged edge of a dead zone where the charts went vague and the nav fixes got slow and strange. 41 recoverable component sockets. Projected haul value high enough that Verge Ops had cut Mara a one-shift window in a standing extraction template and told her to feed the ingot and not to overthink it. The window was the thing that mattered. Verge ran on windows. A rig was profitable only if it cleared a site faster than the next combine could bid the same rec, and a field lead who ran long on a window was a field lead whose next window went to someone cheaper. She was not overthinking it. She was watching the template's grapple seat into socket 1, lock its 4 anchors, and pull, the same firm even, throughput optimized pull it used on every socket of every site. A motion designed by someone on Sol Station who had never put a hand on an inherited component in their life. The component came free, and then it came apart. It did not shatter dramatically. That was the thing Mara would think about later. How quiet it was. The component, a dense inherited lattice about the size of a kneeling figure, simply lost its integrity the instant the even pull crossed some threshold the template did not know existed, and what had been a high-value recoverable unit became a slumping bag of cracked structure venting frost into the dark. On the feed, the strained telltale went from green to a flat dead gray. No alarm. The template logged it as recovered and swung the grapple back towards socket 2.
Hold the template, hold it. Stop the arm.
Her drone tech, a kid named Osei, 2 months out of a reach apprenticeship and 3 pay grades below caring, looked up from his cradleboard.
It logged a clean recovery. Lead. Telltale's just calibration drift. It does that on cold sites. Template wants to keep moving. We're behind cadence as it is.
It's not drift. Stop the arm before it touches socket 2.
He stopped the arm. Mara pulled the socket 1 component up on the close feed and looked at the fracture line for a long, cold moment and felt the bottom drop out of the shift. The break was too clean. It was the kind of break a thing made when it was pulled exactly straight and exactly even past a limit it was never supposed to reach. And she knew that break because 2 years ago a man named Hari Rao had reportedly done it on purpose to a drive core to make a lean worthless, and the story had gone through the independent contractor channels like a fever and come out the other side as combine folklore. Verge's analysts had a name for it. They called destroying inheritance value on purpose the Rao maneuver, and they used it the way you use the name of a disease. A thing reckless contractors did, a thing that cost money. The Combine had built a half-kilometer machine that did the Rao maneuver by accident, 40 times a shift. That was the part that turned her stomach, standing there in the control nook with the dead gray telltale on the feed. Verge's analysts feared the maneuver as a thing reckless men did to spite a lean. They had not noticed that their own flagship template did it on every clean recovery, on every cold site, to every component rich enough to be worth the window. Because the analysts read tonnage cleared in a cracked unit and a whole one both weighed the same going into the sorter's hopper. The Combine had spent a decade optimizing the speed at which it destroyed the thing it was paid to recover, and called the result efficiency and undercut every independent on the frontier with it.
OC. What does the template do to seat the grapple? What's the motion? Walk me through it.
Anchors 4-point. Takes up slack. Pulls even. And firm at the rated load curve. It's the standard recovery template. Lead. It's the same on every site. That's the whole point of it. You don't have to know what the component is. The template just takes it.
That's the whole problem with it.
She had known, working her old independent sites, that you did not pull an inherited component straight and even and firm. Independents knew it the way you knew not to grab a hot pan, not from a manual because the manuals were Sewell licensed and useless, but from forums and from each other and from the ones who'd cracked a unit and never lived it down. You worked a unit crooked. You took up the load and then you waited, and you felt for the place where the component started to give, and you backed off and came at it a different way. And a recovery that the template did in 9 seconds took a careful independent 40 minutes. It was slow and it was unscalable, and it was exactly the thing Verge had decided was obsolete. Throughput, the database said, templates, drones. You don't have to know what the component is. Mara looked at the socket 1 scrap and the 40 intact sockets behind it and did the arithmetic Verge ops would do tomorrow morning. One destroyed component was an anomaly. A site full of them was a write-off. A field lead who cleared a write-off site was a field lead the Combine had no further use for. The window was 1 shift. Ops would not extend it. Ops did not extend windows for sites the template had already half-killed.
So we flag the site degraded and call it in. Template error. Not on us. Ops signed the template, not you.
Ops signed a template that just cracked a recoverable unit on the first pull. You think Ops is going to write that on Ops?
He didn't answer because they both knew. The template was the Combine's. The site was Mara's. She had a shift. She had a half-kilometer of machine built to destroy exactly what she needed to recover. And she had, clipped to her hip under the Verge-branded vest, the battered multi-tool from her independent days that she had never quite been able to leave in a drawer.
We're not flagging it. We're going to go pull a haul by hand. The old way. Suit up. You're coming out with me, and we're leaving the template parked.
By hand. Lead, I've never pulled a component by hand. Nobody at Verge pulls by hand. That's the whole thing we don't do.
Then this'll be a good shift for you. Bring the patch kit. All of it.
The dead zone edge made her uneasy in a way she didn't have words for and didn't try to find. Twice while they suited up the ingot's nav board threw a routine position fix handshake out toward the derelict's drift and got nothing back for a beat too long. The fix hung, unanswered, the way a call hangs when there's no one behind the door, and then resolved late. The site sat at the ragged edge of one of the blank patches the charts didn't explain, and the database had flagged the coordinate not just amber-rich but clustered. Part of a pattern, one of a scatter of strange-behaving derelicts. Verge was quietly mapping for reasons above a field lead's clearance. Rich sites tended to drift near the blank patches. The Combine had noticed. The Combine was making a map. She put it out of her head. She had a component to not break. Socket 2 had a component in it the size of Socket 1's, and Mara made Osei watch her do every part of it. She took up the load on the multi-tool's hand winch, not the template's even-rated curve, but a slow, crooked tension, off-axis, the way you'd ease a stuck bolt rather than yank it. And then she stopped pulling and put her gloved hand flat on the component's housing and listened, which was the part no template could do and no form could quite explain. Inherited components told you things if you held still. This one carried a faint vibration through the glove, a thin, regular tick that changed pitch when the tension came up. And somewhere in that change was the place where the component started to resent the load, the threshold the template crossed 40 times a shift without ever knowing it was there.
There. Feel that? It goes from a hum to a buzz. That buzz is the unit telling you it's about to do what Socket 1 did. You back off the second you feel the buzz, you shift your angle, you come up on it from a place it isn't braced against. You never pull it straight, because straight is where it's strongest, and straight is where it breaks clean.
There's nothing about that in the template. There's nothing about that anywhere.
There's everything about that in the forums. The Combine just decided the forums were obsolete.
It took her 40 minutes. The component came up the way they came up when you respected them. Grudging, intact, whole. She seated it in a hand cradle and felt the old satisfaction she had not felt in 3 years of feeding the ingot. The specific pleasure of a thing recovered alive that a careless hand would have killed.
That took 40 minutes. The template does 1 in 9 seconds.
The template does 1 in 9 seconds and then it's worth nothing. I did 1 in 40 minutes and it's worth something. You want to time the job or you want to weigh what comes home? Because those are not the same number, and the Combine only ever taught you to watch the first one.
Osei didn't have an answer. 2 months out of his apprenticeship, he had been trained to feed a machine, and nobody had ever told him the machine was the part of the operation that knew the least. Then she opened the patch kit, because an intact inherited component was only worth its intact value if it survived the haul, and the dead zone edge was cold in a way that did things to inherited cold mechanisms she didn't pretend to understand. The patches were standard reach hull breach vacuum patches. Every salvage operation carried crates of them, a 2-layer skin with an inert foam pocket that set in 10 seconds, made for slapping over a holed bulkhead. Mara had learned years ago on her own sites that the inert foam was a quietly excellent insulator. It was a thing experienced crews knew and the patch's makers had never intended. The reach engineers who designed the patch were thinking about decompression, not about wrapping a recovered component to keep its temperature stable across a long cold haul. She cracked 4 patches, let the foam swell, and packed them around the component's housing, like a person bandaging something that mattered, using a hull repair as a blanket, the way someone who read forms and not manuals would.
You're wrapping it in breach patches.
I'm insulating it. The foam doesn't care what the box says it's for. Keeps the hull cold off the unit so it gets home reading the same as it reads now. Combine throws these by the crate at holes in walls and never figured out they're the best cheap insulator on the frontier. Independents have been doing this for years.
She did it again at socket 3 and let Osei take the listening at socket 4, with her hand over his on the housing so he could feel the hum go to a buzz and feel himself back off in time. He cracked the first one, she made him do the second, and he got it. And the look on the kid's face through the visor, the specific awe of someone who has just done a thing his entire training told him was impossible and obsolete, was worth more to Mara than the component. They were slow. They were brutally, unscalably slow. By the time the shift window had 2 hours left in it, they had cleared 14 sockets by hand and recovered 11 intact units and cracked 3, which was a better intact rate than Osei could believe, and a worse rate than Mara would admit to liking. The template, left to its even-rated curve, would have cleared all 41 in the time they'd done 14, and brought home 41 bags of cracked scrap. The call came from the Ingots comms relay an hour into the back half of the shift. A Verge Ops liaison, flat and corporate precise, patched through from a hub 2 jumps away.
Field lead Teng. Ops is showing your template parked, and your cadence at roughly a third of projection on a site we windowed for full clear. I want to confirm I'm reading that correctly before I escalate. Are you experiencing equipment failure?
No equipment failure. The template's working exactly as designed. That's the problem. The standard recovery template cracks these units on the first pull. It cracked socket 1 before I parked it. I'm clearing the site by hand to bring back intact value instead of 41 bags of scrap.
By hand. Field lead. The by hand recovery method is not in your approved procedure set, and it puts your tonnage at a third of projection. Tonnage cleared is the contract metric. I have to advise you that Ops will read this as underperformance against a windowed site.
Then Ops should read the value instead of the tonnage. A third of the sockets, intact, is worth more than the whole site cracked. You can put that arithmetic in front of anyone who can multiply.
A pause, the dead zone lag stretching it longer than corporate silence usually stretched.
I'm going to note the site as field lead. Override pending value assessment. I want to be clear that this is your call on your record, not Ops. If the intact value doesn't clear the projection, the override is yours.
It's mine. Note it.
She cut the channel and went back out and pulled 3 more by hand, because the arithmetic only worked if she brought back enough intact units to prove it, and proving it was now the only thing between her and a write-off with her name on it. The decisive hour was the quietest work Mara had ever done. The shift window narrowed. Osei stopped being afraid somewhere around the 18 socket and started being good, his hand learning the buzz, and the 2 of them moved down the derelict's flank in a rhythm that had no cadence number and could not have been templated, listening and backing off and coming up crooked, leaving the cracked ones and taking the whole ones. The dead zone edge threw its slow, unanswered handshakes and Mara ignored them. The foam-wrapped units stacked up in the hand cradle like swaddled things. When the window had 10 minutes left, she made the call to stop. Not because the site was clear, half the sockets still held units they'd had no time to reach, but because a recovered haul that didn't get back inside the rig before the burn home wasn't a recovered haul. She had cleared a third of the site, 18 intact units, foam-wrapped, reading the same temperature and integrity they'd read in their sockets. The rest of the derelict drifted on with its components whole and unreachable, which was its own quiet argument. The Combine could have all 41 as scrap or a third of them alive, and there was no template in the galaxy that could split the difference. She sealed the last unit in the cradle and looked back at the ingot, half a kilometer of machine that had been built to make this exact judgment unnecessary, and felt the thing she'd been not feeling for 3 years, which was that she had been very good at a job that was quietly throwing away most of what it touched. The value assessment came back during the burn home, and the arithmetic held. 18 intact units of an amber-rich category cleared the site's projected value with margin to spare. More than the full 41 would have cleared as scrap, which was 0, minus the cost of hauling 41 bags of cracked structure to a sorter who'd pay by the discount. The Verge Ops liaison sent a single flat line acknowledging the value assessment and closing the override in Mara's favor, with no praise in it, because corporate delivered good news in the same tone as bad. Mara had not expected praise. She had expected to keep her job, and she kept it. It was a partial victory, which was the only kind the Frontier handed out. She had kept her job by proving the Combine's whole method wrong on one site, which was not the same as the Combine being wrong less. Verge would run the numbers and conclude that one field lead's by-hand override on one rich site was an anomaly, not a verdict. The ingot would feed on standard templates tomorrow, and the day after, cracking units 40 times a shift on sites nobody happened to be paying that much attention to. The Combine kept industrializing. It would keep deciding that knowing what a component was had been made obsolete by a machine that didn't have to. Mara had won herself a shift and a paycheck and the small, dangerous reputation among her own crew now of a lead who pulled by hand. She would take it. You took the partial victory and you went back out, because that was the job, and because somewhere in the slow listening hours she had remembered that she used to be good at the part that mattered. She was logging the haul against the site record when the database threw up the coordinates context page. The part above her clearance she usually closed without reading, and she stopped. The Combine's proprietary site map filled the slate. The Frontier, charted not as the Reach charted it, but as Verge charted it, by where the rich, strange derelicts drifted. A scatter of flagged coordinates spread across the sector, dense in places, and her site was one dot in the densest cluster of them all. The Combine was mapping where the amber-rich wrecks gathered, and they gathered, she saw, around the blank patches. The places the charts went vague, the places the nav fixes hung unanswered, the places the components were richest and strangest. And at the center of the densest cluster, where the dots crowded thickest, the map simply stopped. A region the chart left blank. No coordinate, no flag, no derelict. A hole in the middle of the richest hunting on the Frontier, drawn as empty. She had seen a chart do that exactly once before, years ago, riding shotgun on a Reach relay tender's board. A region the relay chart marked in plain stenciled letters, no relay, and left blank, and dog-legged the whole buoy chain around. The tender had said the buoys avoided it on their own, and nobody knew why. Mara looked at the blank place at the center of the cluster. Verge was quietly mapping for profit and did not know it had a name.